1963. I was born, I thought, in Tontine Street, but I've been corrected. I was born in St. Thomas. And when I was born, it was because it was the early 20s, there was a lot of things going on that I didn't realize until I became a young man. And the kind of dress that the people wore in those days, I kind of accepted it. But later on, when they're looking back at the early 20s, you see the ladies dressed in these unusual dresses, and they were doing the Charleston and things like that. I was born pretty much into poverty. I'd like to extrapolate on that a little later on. And because of the situation in Wales, there was a lot of strikes going on. There was a lot of unemployment, as I remember, and my father was a seafaring man, and of course my family history leaves something to be desired in terms of my father got a divorce and what have you. But he did the best he could, and we were, for a while, I remember when I was about 8, 9, 10, something like that, standing in line with my dad down by the YMCA there in Swansea. Behind the back of it, there was an office for the unemployed to get the dole, they called it in those days. And I think my father was getting something like 18 and sixpence for the family. Now, if you look at 18 and sixpence these days, you're looking at less than £1 in the old money. So rent usually was around 4 or 5 shillings. So it didn't leave much out of the 18 and sixpence. Now this is my recollection of things. And I remember the men standing in line, lining up for their dole. It was a long line, and it was raining gently, and the men in those days wore a cap, what today we call it the old Welsh cap. And I saw the rain dripping off that, and my dad used to roll his own, and sometimes he might smoke a Woodbine, and that was a cheap cigarette. And the dejection on their faces of these men, no work except in this money, and a lot of them, I'm sure it hurt because they were proud men. And the acceptance of poverty was pretty much there with all of us, at least all my friends. Okay, Billy Jones, Tommy McCarthy, and a fellow by the name of Black. He used to live down by St. Mary's Church. And a couple of my buddies up on Town Hill, who incidentally got killed when the bombing took place. And I used to move with these guys. We had a little bit of a gang, and I was the ringleader, so to speak. And we were passing behind the old police station one day, and a fella came out of this building, and it was the old Gospel Mission. It's still there today. And he said, "Hey boys," there must have been 4 or 5 of us, "if you want to come in, you can have a drink, a cup of tea, and some cakes." And he said, "We got down in the basement, we've got gymnastic stuff if you want to use it. And we got a bit of a library. And this gentleman was a very, very kind guy. So we used to go there quite a bit. It was someplace for us to go. Well, the police heard about it and they took an interest then in the boys down at the in the basement, and that little bit of a library. Of course, it was religiously oriented, and we knew that, but they didn't preach to us or anything. They were just, I think, happy to give the poor boys, if you will, a place to go, a place to enjoy themselves and have a cup of tea, or they used to have Welsh cakes. And of course that was an attraction because boys are always hungry. And anyway, the police heard about it and they got involved. And that then was the beginning, in my opinion, of the Swansea Boys Club. Because so many boys then heard about this and they used to go to the gospel mission. I don't remember the gentleman's name, but he was one whale of a fine man. And as I recall, the first Swansea Boys Club was really in the gospel mission. And then we moved down to where the Mumbles Railroad used to be. There was a big building there, and it was about 3 or 4 stories. And I think it was rented to begin with, and they had on the first floor snooker, billiards. On the second floor they had a gym. On the third floor then they had a library, and then on the top floor was when guest speakers would come in and talk about the universe, the stars, and they would talk about interesting things. And keep in mind that the Boys Club also gave us clothes, shoes, hobnail boots, pants, underclothes, shirts, jackets. And of course, if you look at that kind of activity, who was behind it? The business people of Swansea. Now, I had at one time a pamphlet talking all about this, and I gave it to the chief of police. When we moved from the gospel mission down into that new building near the Mumbles Railroad, when I first went in there, it was after school, it was, because St. David's School was right near the Boys Club. I was introduced to a gentleman called Mr. Hopkins and his wife, Mrs. Hopkins. And they were in charge, I suppose, of the Swansea Boys Club right there. And I was led to understand that Mr. Hopkins was an ex-military man, and I think his son was also in the military. And Mr. Hopkins was very strict. He had a good sense of humor, and he was just like a father to us. He was gentle when he had to be, and he was strict when he had to be. Mrs. Hopkins was, in my estimation, a mom to all of us. She was just a terrific lady, and we all had respect for her, and she at times would give us tea and some pancakes because she knew we were hungry. Also, because of their efforts, we used to have the opportunity to get the occasional shirt or socks or some kind of clothes, because Mr. Hopkins and his wife were those kind of people. They were just great. And because of their ability to keep us boys in line, we grew up respecting older people, we respected the police, and we had respect for ourselves. To help Mr. and Mrs. Hopkins, the local community, the businessmen, they would put in some money into the boys' club to get us different things. And also like a ping pong table or whatever. And the police, I think, way back then had a special appeal to raise up some money. And then there was a lady by the name of Mrs. Aaron Thomas. Do you know her? Right. Mrs. Aaron Thomas lived on the Mumbles, and her husband was, he was into shipping, transportation. He was a very wealthy man, apparently. And his wife took an interest in the boys, and she would sometimes give us tickets so we could go swimming down the baths, which I loved. I loved to swim. And also she had an MG, and occasionally maybe 3 or 4 of us boys could sit in the back, and she'd give us a ride from the boys' club down to the slip sands. And then of course we had to walk back, which was all right, and we loved that ride in that automobile, by golly. And she ensured that there were enough funds, because she would help to raise money to make the Swansea Boys Club an attractive thing for young boys, poor boys. And I'd like to emphasize just that. The Swansea Boys Club was for poor boys. There were some other boys in there whose, well, one boy I remember, his dad was an attorney. He went to St. David's School, and he loved it, and he was accepted like the rest of us. We didn't differentiate between poor and not poor. And we were, to use an army expression, we were a band of brothers. And if one of us was in trouble, you always got help from the boys. While I was at the club, I stole some beer flagons from the Great Western Railroad carriages, because we could get tuppence on them if we took them into the pub. So we would steal maybe 3 or 4, what have you. And Billy Jones was in on it, and McCarthy and Blanco, I think it was Charlie Blanco. And we used to use that money then to go to the pictures. But the police found out, and we had to go then and answer to that up at the police station. And I remember my mother coming with me, and the clips on the back of the head I got from her because I'd been naughty. And the police, there was a table there with a man and a couple of women, and they asked us why we did that. And we said, well, we wanted to go to the pictures. And they asked us, are you sorry for what you did? And I said, I'm very, very sorry. I put 3 verys in there. And the other boys, they all apologized, and we were let off then with a kind of a slap on the wrist. What I'm leading up to in a very cumbersome way here is that the boys' club found out about us being up at the police station. So Mr. Hopkins got us one side and talked to us about that. And he said, you let the boys' club down by doing that. If you wanted to go to the movies or what have you, we might be able to help occasionally. There's no need to steal. And above all, the Swansea Boys Club was honesty, citizenship, helping. And this manifested itself in Cliffguard when I was 15 and 16. And I always thought about the kind of comradeship, supervision, the police, Mrs. Erin Thomas, and the tremendous input this woman had. There were other ladies too that were helping, and I don't remember their name especially, but the Boys Club was based upon community effort, that's for sure. And as I said a minute ago, the business people really, really helped out. After I left the Boys Club, I must have been about 14, I think. Incidentally, I've got to come back to the Boys Club. There's one thing that happened there that had a big influence on my life. They taught me to box. And I used to box then for the Boys Club up in the valleys. I was only 14, but and when the Brangwyn Hall opened, the Boys Club had a show down there, right after it opened. And they had a boxing ring, and I was boxing with Jimmy, I forget his last name, Doyle I think it was. And we put on a show in gymnastics and what have you. But because the Boys Club taught me how to really box, that had a big influence in the way I conducted my life. Because without it, I wouldn't have had the kind of personality and the motivation, determination. All these things came about because of the Boys Club and that boxing and the gymnastics. Now then, after I left the Boys Club, as I said a while ago, I got a job in the Welsh Glassworks. And it was with leaded lights. And the Welsh Glassworks then was, as you come out of Salisbury's Passage, as if you go into the Mumbles train, as you come to the end of the passage, if you turned immediate right, that's up there was the Welsh Glassworks. It was an enormous place. Of course, they moved now, as you know. And I was offered a job through the Boys Club, whether I'd want to go there and become an apprentice for leaded lights. Well, I tried it for about 3 or 4 months. And I learned how to put in the different colored glass, how to cut the glass, how to fit the lead in, how to waterproof it, how to strengthen the panels. I learned a lot about it. But, and I was getting 10 shillings a week. 50 pence a week. I used to give my mother about 6 shillings, and I kept the rest then for me so I didn't have to steal any bottles to go to the movies. And when I was thinking about should I stay with the Welsh Glassworks or did I want something else, so I really wanted to join the British Navy. That was what I wanted to do. I was in the Sea Cadets when I was 13. And I loved it. And I was even taught how to semaphore and all this kind of stuff. And they did more how to teach you to box. And we used to go down the docks and row these little boats. And I loved being in the Sea Scouts. And I wanted then to go to the Navy. So I had a talk with my mother. And she said, "What do you want about the Navy?" I said, "I want to join the Navy." She said, "You're only 14. I said, "I can lie about my age." She said, "You ain't going." I said, "Why not?" She said, "Because I said so." And of course my mother had that big wedding ring like that, and she'd hit you in the back of the head if you didn't pay attention. It's like in the States, I'm from Missouri, I hit you with a 2x4 to get your attention. She had the ring. And also, talking about that, when she hit me, my brothers would get one too, for good measure. Being an Irish lady, she was quick on the draw when you didn't do right. Anyway, she said, no, you ain't going in the Navy. I said, okay, but I said, I'll go to sea. No, you won't, she said. But she didn't know her son. So when I was almost 15, I said to my dad, I want to go to sea. Well, he said, you can join my ship now. We're looking for a cabin boy. I said, don't tell Mom. I said, let's do it. So we went down, and the office in those days for the shipping was right near the drawbridge by the Towie. So I had to go there, and I signed this, and he said, how old are you? I said, I'm 16. He said, you're awfully small. I said, yeah, I can't help that. So he signed me up, and he said, you'll be with your dad anyway, which I was. And it turned out that that was almost 1939 then, and keep in mind the war started September the 2nd or the 3rd in 1939. So when the war started, I was in Montreal, Canada. And of course my dad, as I say, was on the same ship. And I didn't realize what they meant by war. I didn't have any concept of what war was. I was just a boy. But I grew up rather quickly. That's for doggone sure. When we left Montreal, we had to go down to a number of places, including America, and we took on a whole bunch of food. I remember that. All kinds of canned food that we took. And we weren't a refrigerated ship, so we didn't take any meat or anything, but it was all canned goods. And half the hold was full of baby toys. I remember that. And I thought, this is a lovely thing, taking these back home. And then that was my first introduction to convoys. Now, any man that's served in the Navy and the Merchant Navy will tell you that there are two places that are sheer hell, the North Atlantic and then the run up to Russia, the Arctic run. Those were the two nasties. These convoys were very, very useful because you had protection from each other. Because when we got back to Great Britain, they put in, I think they called it a 6-pounder. I'm not familiar with these terms. And then there were 4 Navy guys coming on board. And then the ship, all merchant ships around them were degaussed. Do you know what I mean by that? It was all degaussed. Anyway, we didn't have that privilege when we left the first time from the United States coming in on this convoy. There were, I would conjecture, 35, 40 ships perhaps. And the convoy went as fast as the slowest ship. I remember the American Navy and the Canadian Navy, they were escorting us because the war now was in place with Great Britain and Germany. And already the German submarines were in force in the Atlantic. And that first trip that we went on, We were constantly on the lookout for U-boats, and on the first trip I didn't see any that I can recall. And I do remember, as I said a while ago, the ship being outfitted. I went back on that ship, back out to Nova Scotia, and then down to America to pick up all these foods and medicines. And if it hadn't been for the cooperation between the Royal Navy, the Canadian Navy, and the Americans giving us some hand when we left, they escorted us a little bit. They weren't supposed to, but they did. I was on that route for a good 2.5, maybe 3 years. And then I went on other ships going down the Pacific, through the Panama Canal, which I've been through a couple of times, up to the west coast of the United States and Canada, and taking materials down to Australia and New Zealand. I've been to Auckland, Wellington, Dunedin, Timaru, you name it. I've been to all the islands on New Zealand. And the people there were, including the Maoris, were absolutely lovely. And then, of course, I went across to Australia, Brisbane, Sydney, Melbourne, Adelaide, and I really, really enjoyed that. Now, what I'm leading up to here in a very cumbersome way is this. I joined a ship called the Katuna, and she was going back down to Australia. When we got to South Africa, we went into Cape Town, and I could spend a lot of time talking about what happened there, but I think we'll move along. I went from Cape Town up to Sierra Leone, which, as you know, is called White Man's Grave. That was a very unusual. We were anchored out of the city itself because we weren't allowed to go alongside because the fear of us catching whatever it was. And we had to take medicine every night while we were on board, anchored off this place. One of the things that sticks in my mind about that, there was a gentleman in a canoe, a rather large canoe, and he had trinkets that he wanted to sell. And of course we had a line and a bucket. So if we wanted something, we would shout to him what we wanted. His English was very good, actually. And he was a very funny man. He had a top hat on, and he used to sing "Hallelujah, I'm a bum" as he was paddling along around the ship. And if you wanted whatever he had, you'd holler that you'd want the bracelets or what have you, put them in a bucket, and then whatever money, he couldn't care less because he used to take it to the bank. On his second and final trip that he came out, he had a monkey. Now that monkey jumped from the canoe onto the anchor chain, and he ran up the anchor chain and got on board. This is in the book. And we had this monkey, we sailed the next day, couldn't get it and give it back to the man. And we had this monkey running up the mast and all over the bloody place, right? None of us knew that Captain Ella wore a wig. And we found out in a very unusual way. This monkey, to try and get food, used to go in the galley and what have you, and the cooks used to let him get in there and some scraps and what have you. And the captain said, we've got to capture this monkey and cage it because I don't want it running around the way it is. We tried, we couldn't. But we got it cornered one time, and what it had on his head was this wig that I think Captain Heller used to wear. And it was the funniest thing to see this monkey with his bloody wig running all over the place, going up the mast, holding onto the wig. And finally, it did drop the wig, and it went back to the captain. And later on that day, it went in the galley and it burnt its feet on the stove and it jumped over into the sea. And that's the last we saw of the monkey. And I think that's an hilarious story because I could see the monkey with the wig running all over the place with his two little hands holding the doggone thing down. We got to South America, and as I said a while ago, the Montevideo and Buenos Aires, and I was at both places. And I saw, when I went ashore, German sailors. They were young boys just like us. There was no animosity, nothing like that. Of course, the British Navy wasn't in there. We were merchant marine, or merchant navy, and we didn't have a uniform on. We had a little pen, and which I can show you after. And we talked to some of these fellows, and they had a fair command, some of them, of the British language. And apparently, when he scuttled the ship, he committed suicide, apparently. That's what I understand. I don't know what history says about it. And what impressed me was to see the British, Australian and New Zealand navies out there. And they were rather big men of war. There's no doubt about that. And when I went ashore, as I said a minute ago, the people in Buenos Aires and Montevideo were very, very friendly. Not only to us, but to the German boys as well. So here you have a situation where you've got German and British boys in the same place, so to speak, and there was no animosity. I didn't see any of it. There were some British naval people in, I think it was Buenos Aires, something in one of those towns, and there was no animosity, and it was most unusual. It kind of brings to mind the story during World War I when both sides were playing football. And I thought that was rather a pleasant thing. After I left South America, I went up then to New York. I knew a family on Staten Island, and they befriended me. He was a physician. And I've been into New York quite a number of times while I was in the British Merchant Service, picking up food and other things, as I said before. And I got a liking for the Americans. And I went to a swimming pool there in Brooklyn, and I'd been there for about an hour, then it was closing. And what really impressed me, and it was kind of touching, when they closed the swimming pool, they played the national anthem. So people put their hand on their heart and they looked at the flag. And they sang the national anthem. And I thought, what an attachment to country, to put their hand and thank God for where they were. And that had quite a lasting effect on me, which was part and parcel of me wanting to become American. But more profoundly than that, my father, who was a seaman, he said to me when I was quite young, if you get to the United States and you got the opportunity, stay there. So I said, why, Dad? He said, you can get ahead. There's nothing in this country for you. Wales is a very poor country. We're struggling. There's nothing here. So I took this on board. And I'm glad that I did, because it gave me an opportunity to see, to understand, to appreciate a working democracy. Now, keep in mind, as we said a while ago, that this country is supposed to be the cradle of democracy. There are some people that take issue with this, and I think I tend to join them in certain respects. But when I went to the United States, I saw people that were, to me, a poor boy coming from Swansea, these people were rich. They had cars, they had all kinds of food, on and on and on. And their attitude was one of friendliness. If you asked where such and such a place was, they wouldn't tell you, come, we'll show you. They'll take you, that kind of thing. And while I was in the British Merchant Navy, and while I was in New York, before, the war was on then, and I went down Broadway, and I saw all these Yankee guys with their Navy uniform on, and soldiers and what have you, and the people used to stop and shake their hands. Thank you for being part of the service that's going to save our country. And all these kind of things kind of stuck with me, because I thought, wouldn't it be nice to stay over here like Dad said years ago? And when I came up then from South America into New York, that's when I did it. I knew this man who was, I think he was on the draft board, and he asked me what I wanted to do with my life, and I said, well, I'd like to join the Yankee Navy. He said, we can't get you in the Navy, but we can get you in the U.S. Army. I said, I'm your man. I'll make you a good soldier. And that's how I got into the American Army. When I was enlisted and or drafted, I should say, because I was drafted and I consented to be drafted, I went to Camp Upton, New York. And that was a staging area for medicals, for issue of uniform, for instructions how to behave, okay? And some of the history about the American Army. And that took about 4 or 5 days, that induction. And I remember it well as if it was yesterday. I put on my American uniform. And I looked in that mirror, by God, in the wardrobe there. And I felt so proud that at last I was American and I could contribute something to the United States and an opportunity to pay back the Germans for bashing my town around and killing all these people. This was going through my mind. I got on a train with literally hundreds of GIs going from Camp Upton, New York, into Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri. So, as you know, Fort Leonard Wood is near the spur of the Rockies, or mountains, and it is doggone cold up there. So, when I got on this train, we had our duffel bag, which was about that big, and we had our M1 rifles and no live ammunition, because you were assigned the rifle and you were assigned other things. So on the train up there, these guys sitting opposite me, they're nice guys, but one of them was a big joker. And I fell asleep. And I woke up and I nearly jumped through the ceiling of the carriage. Someone gave me a hot foot. Do you know what that is? Right. Take some matches, shave them with your little penknife, and you stick them right there, right in there, on your shoe, right? And they stuck that in my shoe, and of course when it burns down, and it really gives you hell. And if you don't get at it quick enough, you can have a nasty burn on your foot. Well, these guys sat opposite to me, and they were laughing up a storm. They give Limey a hot foot, right? And it was quite painful. So I thought, well, let them go to sleep, and Cliffy, because I had some matches on me, Cliffy would reciprocate. This one guy is a Jewish boy from New York, a hell of a nice guy. He and I became the best mates. He was in the middle, and he was the guy that gave the hot foot, and the others joined in. So anyway, I put in 3, right? And with the guy in the middle, I gave him 2, right? So I waited a spell, he was in there, they were snoring, and I lit the match. In about a minute, whang, 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 they were going up to the bloody ceiling, and they were jumping around, and they were cussing and what have you, and Limey just sat there, by God, and when they settled down, I said, that's called reciprocation. They didn't know what the hell I was talking about, but they knew that I had done it, right? And I said, if you're going to joke, we all joke. And I said, it hurt. He said, by God, it did hurt. I said, well, I just went through it thanks to you guys. So we became the best of friends. We were a band of brothers. We didn't know what we were going to get into altogether. And I was assigned then to the 23rd Armoured Engineers, and I was into explosives, mines, detonators, how to, on a structure of a bridge where you could get do the most damage if you put in a certain amount of, it wasn't dynamite, it was a special composition seed, it was plastic, it was. They also taught you how to search for mines with your bayonet and being careful because the German telemine had a cap on it like that, and if that went off, you were dead. So you had to look for that, and sometimes that would be attached in a series of 3 or 4 telemines, and these telemines were like a big dinner plate about that thick, and the pressure on top, of course, if a tank went over it, boom, it went. But also if you messed with it, you could set it off. And their engineers were very, very clever boys. And they also showed us how to booby trap and how to de-booby trap. It also taught us how to use a bayonet on a bayonet charge, 5-mile hikes and that kind of stuff. And it was very, very useful, and they got you in shape. You lost weight and you really put on the muscles. And you felt good, no doubt about it. And that was for 90 days. And during those 90 days, you got a damn good orientation to the American Army. Because we used to go into large theaters, and they would stand there and explain about the Army, the policy, procedures, rules, regulations about the Army, and all that kind of stuff. When I was there, towards the last couple of weeks, a guy came up to me, Sergeant. He said, the captain wants to see you. I thought, what the hell's going on here? So I said, okay. He said, we go now. I said, okay. So I went up. And there were 2 guys sitting there, just like you guys are sitting there. well-dressed, well-spoken, well-groomed. Are you Cliff Guard? Yes. Where are you from? Swansea, South Wales. Yeah, well, we knew that, but we wanted to double check with you. They knew all about me. FBI. Right. They questioned me about this, this and this, and they said, you were with the British Merchant Navy, weren't you? Etc., etc. Your mother's name is Annie Sullivan, what have you? Yes, sir. I said. Now then, the question is, this one fellow said, do you want to stay in the American Army or do you want us to get you out so you get on a ship and go back home? And I said to this fellow, and I looked him in the eye, I said, America. I said, I want to stay in the Yankee Army and I want to do the best I can. He said, you're in. I said, thank you. 3 weeks after that, I went to Lebanon in Pennsylvania to the federal court, and I was sworn in then with the allegiance to the United States of America and all that stands for, which I did. And there were about 14 guys standing next to me. It was hot. By God, it was hot. And this judge man up there on that podium, he was just talking about how grand the United States is, the Grand Canyon, telling us all about the lovely country, which was very, very interesting. But we were sweating, because we had on our class a uniform on. Anyway, after about a half an hour, he quietened down and he said, welcome to America. On the way out, there were two guys standing there, and they had these bundles of paper, and I thought that that was my American citizenship. Nope. This guy said to me, you don't get your American citizenship papers until you get discharged from the United States Army and an honorable discharge. Oh, I said, are you sure? He said, yeah. And the other guys, they all looked, and this is what we had to do. So we went back to camp with that knowledge, and I won't get into a lot of it, but I had a 3-day pass when I was at Fort Leonard Wood. I went down to, I forget the name of the town now, and I had a nice, I think it was 2-day pass, if I'm not mistaken, and I really enjoyed that. Went back, and then we were shipped down to Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. Now then, I had never seen such a mass of military might in my life. Miles and miles of it. It was the 3rd Armored Division. And they were trying to assign us to different things. And as I said a while ago, I was trained as an engineer. But this guy said to me, he said, hey Limey, do you want an easy job? You can do it now, we can make you a cook. I said, bugger off. I said, I want to get in and get a chance to get at the krauts. You sure? He said. I said, yeah. Well, he said, being a cook and plenty of chow? I said, no, thank you. I said, Cliffy's going to go into the engineers. So they assigned me then to the 23rd Armored Engineers. And that's where I met Trix and the Greek. And we were buddies then all the way through the war, up until I met the Russians on the River Elba. We went down to Camp Kilmer. Well, Kilmer wrote, he was a poet, he was, and well thought of in the United States. And it was a staging area. And it was a massive place, because keep in mind we had all these tanks and half-tracks, jeeps, you name it. We were there, I would conjecture, about a week or 10 days. And we were getting an orientation then about this country. The do's and don'ts, the way to behave, and no bragging, and no getting the locals teed off at you, and this kind of stuff. And respect the women and what have you, because their men are off fighting. And we went through all these orientations. And then that day, I remember it well, they said to us, pack good, because you're going to get on a ship tonight. And we all said, well, where are we going? They said, none of your business, but you're getting on a ship. Now, I was in New Jersey, right, at Camp Kilmer. So we had to come from Jersey into New York onto Staten Island, where I lived. That was my home. So keep in mind, there were thousands of us, and they were moving a lot of guys to come over here. And there was this big, enormous ship called the John Erickson. We got on board that, and it was raining, and we were going up that gangplank with a rifle and our duffel bags. And Trix was behind me. He was bitching because he couldn't carry it. I helped him some. And the Greek. And we got on board. And they put us in the hold. Now the hold of a ship, if you've ever been aboard a ship, the holds are quite big. And they'd been fitted out for troops. In other words, double deckers. And it wasn't just one or two, we had about 4 or 5. We pulled out of Staten Island, and I was on deck with Trix and my buddies. And we could look at the Statue of Liberty all lit up as we were leaving. And of course these guys were all leaving home. I was going home. And Trix said, look at that lady, doesn't she look grand with that torch? I said, you betcha. I heard the guys saying, well, it's going to be a while since till we see that again. And somebody shouted, hey, Limey, you're going home, aren't you? I said, well, yeah. And they said, what can we expect? I said, well, we'll talk about it later. Anyway, we pulled out of Staten Island, New York Harbor, and of course we could look across at Brooklyn, and I love Brooklyn because I've been there many times and had some good friends there. And I felt kind of emotional passing Brooklyn, because I knew that we were going to go overseas, and the purpose, I knew what we were going to do. We were there to fight. And it was an emotional thing for me, leaving like that. But eventually, when we got out to sea, the guys down in the hold were seasick, and it was a terrible smell. And there were other noises too, which I won't go into. And guys smoking their cigarettes and cigars and what have you. And I said to my mates, I said, we're going to get out of this. he said, what are you going to do, jump over the side of the ship? I said, don't be so soft. I said, I'll get us out of there. So I went up and see the cook. Had a nice chat with him. And he says, oh, so you were in the Merchant Marine? I said, you were telling me? I said, yeah. And I said, we're quite useful hands in the kitchen, washing dishes, and all that kind of stuff. And maybe a job on peeling potatoes and what have you. He said, we could use you. He said, how many are there? I said, there's 3 of us. And he said, are they good workers? I said, they're the best. So that fella, he kind of looked at me, by God, he had a big smile come across his face. And he said, you're hired. I said, now wait a minute, I said, there's a few conditions here. Oh, he said, you're a technical man. I said, yes. I said, if we come and do all this work for you, I said, we want to sleep in the storeroom. Why is that, he said. I said, poke your nose in hole number 3. I got it, he said. He said, that's no problem at all. And that's where we slept. Instead of going down into that horrible hole. I felt sorry for a lot of the guys down there, to be honest with you, but there you are. That's war. We were in there to do a crossing of the Atlantic. And the crossing wasn't bad, except at times we had a couple of nasty storms, and anybody that knows the Atlantic knows that it can be very, very rough. Other than that, it was pretty much uneventful. Of course, we played cards, poker, and I was pretty good at poker because I've got a face that doesn't give away what my cards are. And we just sat around and talked about Fort Leonard Wood and Indian Town Gap and things like that. And we did exercise, keep our bodies in shape. And of course, we worked quite a bit too. We worked real hard for that fella because he was one whale of a fine guy. And the thing also was, he said, now if you guys want a hamburger or whatever you want, he says, no problem. Well, we ate him out of locker, didn't we? Well, we were young guys, and by God, we were hungry, so we just pitched in, and he kept feeding us, which was good. And he was a nice guy anyway, good sense of humor, I remember him well. He was like my finger, he was so skinny. And running around the deck, as I said a while ago, that was to try and keep us in shape when the weather was good. The weather wasn't all that good, but there were days when we could do that. And as they say down in Texas, a lot of time we just sit around and lie to each other. And we got to know a lot of the guys. And I made a few bucks in poker, that's for sure. And we had lectures from our officers about Great Britain. And there is a book that they give us, How to Treat the Limeys. Don't go bragging about this, and don't go telling them about this and that, because they've been in the war long before we came over. And be nice to the ladies, but not overly nice. And if you're invited into a British home, what's your custom? And when you have food, take very, very little, because they don't have very much, and they're probably serving you food that's going to last them for a week. So we had those kind of lectures, and then of course some of the history of this country, and they also talked a little bit about politics, Churchill, and that kind of stuff. So it was a general orientation, and we had several of those about going into Great Britain. And they also told us about their army and navy and the history behind it that Great Britain has. And the guys were genuinely interested. to get this kind of information and about the history. And we were then given these books. I got my original Army paybook from 1943-44 and 45. So the trip, we didn't experience any German submarine activity, fortunately. But then again, of course, we had, because of the number of troops, were in their thousands, and the John Ericsson was only one troop ship. My conjecture is that there were a number of them, and you're talking thousands and thousands of GIs. And we were well protected, and that's what I'm leading up to in a cumbersome way here, protected by the Canadian Navy, and the Yanks give a hand. They weren't supposed to, but they did. And the Canadian, and then on the other side, when we crossed, the British there with the men of war. They were there to protect us, because between Ireland and Great Britain, that submarine alley there, you know. And of course we had to be careful of mines and what have you when we were going in. And if I'm not mistaken, it was my birthday.